Across the American Southwest, the great reservoirs that hold back the water on which millions of people depend are emptying, their levels falling year after year, their vast basins revealing rings of pale rock where the water once stood. These reservoirs, built over the last century to tame the rivers and to store their water through the dry seasons and the dry years, were meant to give the Southwest security, a buffer against the natural swings of a region where the rain is scarce and the droughts are long. For decades, they did exactly that, filling behind their towering dams and providing the water and the power that allowed the desert cities and the farms to grow into what they are today. But now those reservoirs are shrinking, drawn down faster than the rivers can refill them, and the buffer that once seemed so secure is thinning, leaving the Southwest with fewer and fewer options as the water it depends on grows scarce. This is the story of America's emptying reservoirs and of a region running short on the choices it once had. Before we begin, one honest word about what all of this means. To say the reservoirs are emptying and that the Southwest is running out of options does not mean the taps are about to run dry or that catastrophe is upon us tomorrow. It means the margin of safety that these reservoirs once provided is shrinking, that the easy answers have mostly been used up, and that the region now faces harder and more painful choices than it did before. Understanding why the reservoirs are emptying and why the options are narrowing is the key to understanding the true shape of the water crisis in the American Southwest, and that understanding is what this video is here to provide. Real quick before we go further, a lot of people watch these all the way to the end, genuinely enjoy them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a small channel like ours alive, hitting subscribe. It is honestly important right now. Our sub rate is low, and every single tap makes a real difference, so if you find this valuable, please subscribe right now. It takes 1 second and it costs you nothing. And drop the name of your city in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. What a reservoir really is, and why it matters to understand why the emptying of the Southwest reservoirs is so serious. It helps to understand what a reservoir really is and what it does. A reservoir is a great artificial lake, formed when a dam is built across a river and the water backs up behind it, filling the valley upstream. But it is far more than a lake. It is a savings account of water, a store built up in the wet times to be drawn upon in the dry ones. The rivers of the Southwest do not flow evenly through the year or from one year to the next. They swell with the melting snow in the spring and run low in the heat of late summer, and they run high in the wet years and low in the dry ones. Without storage, the water would come when it was not needed and be absent when it was, and the desert cities and farms could never rely upon it. The reservoirs solve this problem by capturing the water when it is abundant and holding it, releasing it steadily through the dry months, and crucially, carrying it over from the wet years into the dry ones. It is worth pausing on just how remarkable this arrangement is, because it is easy to take for granted. In a region where the rain falls sparingly and the summers are long and fierce, the reservoirs made it possible for water to be available on demand. In the driest month of the driest year, as though the desert itself had been persuaded to keep a hidden store, a farmer could plant a crop, knowing the water would be there to bring it to harvest, and a city could welcome new residents, knowing the taps would run. This reliability, manufactured out of concrete and engineering, was the quiet foundation beneath everything the modern Southwest became. It removed the ancient fear of the dry year, the fear that has haunted desert peoples for as long as they have lived in arid lands, and it replaced that fear with a confidence so complete that most people simply stopped thinking about where their water came from at all. That confidence was possible only because the reservoirs held a buffer deep enough to ride out not just a single dry season, but a run of dry years, and it is exactly that depth of buffer that is now being lost. This is why the great reservoirs of the Southwest were built, and why they became the foundation of the region's astonishing growth. Behind their dams, they stored enough water to smooth out the swings of the rivers and to provide a buffer that could last through several dry years in a row. That buffer was what gave the region confidence, what allowed it to build great cities in the desert and to farm land that would otherwise have been barren. The reservoirs also generate electricity as the water passes through their dams, powering the very cities they supply, and they provide places for recreation that draw millions of visitors. But their central purpose, the reason they matter most, is storage, the holding of water against the dry times. And it is precisely this storage that is now being depleted, as the reservoirs empty faster than they can be refilled. Why the reservoirs are emptying the emptying of the Southwest reservoirs is the result of a simple and unforgiving imbalance. More water is being taken out of them and flowing to the cities and the farms than is flowing into them from the rivers. When this happens year after year, the level of the reservoir falls, and the store of water that took decades to build up is drawn down. Several forces have combined to create this imbalance, and together they explain why the reservoirs are shrinking. The first is the long drought that has gripped the Southwest for much of the past quarter century, one of the most severe and persistent dry spells the region has seen in centuries. Year after year, the rivers have run below their historical averages, bringing less water into the reservoirs than the system was designed to expect. The second force is the warming climate, which intensifies the drought and works against the reservoirs in ways beyond simply reducing the rain. Warmer temperatures mean more of the precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, and the snow that does fall melts earlier and faster, disrupting the natural timing on which the system depends. The heat also dries the soil, so that more of the water that would have reached the rivers is instead absorbed into the parched ground or lost to evaporation before it ever arrives. And the heat evaporates water directly from the surface of the reservoirs themselves, so that even the water already stored is being lost to the warming air. The third force is demand. The Southwest has grown enormously over the decades, its cities swelling and its farms expanding, and the amount of water drawn from the rivers and the reservoirs has been vast. For much of the 20th century, the system was allocated and used as though the rivers would always carry the generous flows recorded in the years when the great agreements dividing the water were first made. But those years, it turned out, were unusually wet, and the rivers have carried less on average since. The result is a system that promises more water than the rivers now reliably provide, so that even in normal times, the demand presses hard against the supply, and in the dry years, it far exceeds what flows in. When more is taken out than comes in, the reservoirs must make up the difference from their stored water, and so they empty. This is the imbalance at the heart of the crisis, drought and heat reducing the inflow while demand keeps the outflow high, drawing the great reservoirs down toward levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The great reservoirs in decline, the emptying, is most visible in the largest reservoirs of the Southwest, the vast stores held behind the region's greatest dams, which together form the backbone of its water supply. These reservoirs were once so full that they seemed inexhaustible, their waters stretching for miles behind the dams that created them. In recent years, however, they have fallen dramatically, dropping to levels far below their capacity and exposing the pale mineral rings on the surrounding rock that mark where the water once reached. A stark and sobering measure of how much has been lost. As these great reservoirs decline, the consequences ripple outward through everything that depends on them. Their falling levels threaten the generation of electricity at their dams because the power depends on the water being high enough to flow through the turbines with sufficient force, and if the levels drop too far, the generation is reduced or could cease altogether. Their decline forces difficult decisions about how much water can be released downstream to the cities and the farms that rely on it, decisions that pit the needs of one region against another and one purpose against another. And their falling levels are a warning, a visible sign that the store of water built up over generations is being spent faster than it is being replenished. The sight of these once mighty reservoirs reduced to a fraction of their former volume has become the defining image of the Southwest's water crisis, a picture that captures, more powerfully than any number, the reality that the region is drawing down its reserves and running short of the water it has long taken for granted. There is something particularly unsettling about watching a reservoir shrink, because the decline is so visible and so slow. Unlike a sudden disaster that strikes and passes, the emptying of these reservoirs unfolds year after year, the water retreating a little further each season, exposing more of the drowned landscape that the rising waters once covered. Old roadbeds, the foundations of buildings, and the channels of the original rivers reappear as the water falls, ghostly reminders of the world that existed before the dams were built. Marinas that once floated on deep water find themselves stranded far from the shrinking shoreline, and boat ramps built to reach the water end abruptly in dry, cracked mud. Each of these small changes tells the same larger story, that the great buffer is thinning, and that what is being revealed as the water retreats is not just the old landscape, but the limits of a system that was built for a wetter world than the one the Southwest now inhabits. Quick question I would genuinely love your take on, and it takes 10 seconds. When you picture these giant reservoirs half empty, with those pale rings around the rock, does it surprise you how far they have fallen? Drop a yes or a no in the comments, because your answers help me understand what catches people off guard, and I read every single reply. Okay, back to it. Why the Southwest is running out of options for most of the history of the Southwest's water crisis. There were options, ways to respond to the shortfall that did not require truly painful sacrifice. The region could draw down the reservoirs, spending the water saved up over the years of plenty. It could pump more groundwater from beneath the ground to make up for the shortfall in the rivers. It could negotiate agreements to share the reductions and to leave more water in the reservoirs. And it could invest in conservation, wringing more use out of every drop through efficiency and reduced waste. These options gave the region room to maneuver, ways to absorb the shortfall without confronting its deepest choices. But as the reservoirs continue to empty, these options are being used up, one by one, and the room to maneuver is shrinking. The reservoirs themselves are the clearest example. Drawing them down was the first and easiest response to the shortfall, but that option only works as long as there is water in them to draw. As they approach the low levels where power generation is threatened and where the water can no longer be reliably released, the buffer they provided is nearly exhausted. And the option of simply spending the stored water is running out. The groundwater is another example. Pumping more from beneath the ground helped the region through the dry years, but the groundwater in many places has been drawn down heavily, the water table falling and the very land sinking as the aquifers are depleted. And this too is an option with limits that are being reached. Conservation has achieved a great deal, and the region uses water far more efficiently than it once did. But there is a limit to how much more can be saved, and the easy gains have largely been made. And the agreements to share the reductions grow harder and more painful with each new round, as the cuts required grow deeper, and the parties are asked to give up more of the water they have long relied upon. This is what it means to say the Southwest is running out of options. It does not mean that nothing can be done, for a great deal can still be done, and the region is far from helpless. But it means that the easy answers have mostly been used, that the buffer of stored water is nearly spent, that the groundwater is being depleted, that conservation is reaching its limits, and that what remains are the harder and more painful choices, the deep cuts to farming, the difficult negotiations, the expensive new sources, and the fundamental question of how to bring the region's demand for water back into balance with what the rivers can actually provide. The options that remain are real, but they are costly and difficult. And the comfortable room to maneuver that the region once enjoyed is gone. Quick pause, because this part matters, and it deserves to be seen by more people. If you are getting real value from this, tap the like button. It genuinely helps the video reach others who care about where their water comes from. And if you have family or friends anywhere in the Southwest, share this with them. Because it honestly matters that the people who depend on this water understand what is happening to it. One like, one share to someone in your family, and let's keep going. The options that remain, though the easy choices have been used up, the Southwest is not without options, and it is worth understanding clearly what remains, because the future of the region depends on how well it uses the harder choices still available. The first and most important is bringing demand into balance with supply, which means, above all, changes in agriculture, since farming uses by far the largest share of the region's water. This does not necessarily mean the end of farming, but it does mean difficult decisions about which crops are grown, how efficiently the water is used, and how much land is farmed, decisions that carry real costs for the communities and the economies that depend on agriculture. The hardest arithmetic of the Southwest's water future runs through its farms, because that is where the largest volumes of water are, and no lasting balance can be reached without addressing them. The second remaining option is new sources of water, chief among them the removal of salt from seawater and from brackish groundwater, and the recycling of used water to a level where it can be used again. These sources are drought-proof in a way that the rivers are not, because they do not depend on the rain or the snow, and they offer a genuine hedge against the uncertainty of the reservoirs. But they are expensive and demand a great deal of energy, and they cannot by themselves replace the vast volumes the rivers provide, though they can supplement the supply and add resilience. The third remaining option is continued and deeper conservation, pushing the efficiency of every use still further. Capturing stormwater, reducing waste, and rethinking the landscapes and habits that consume water needlessly. And the fourth is cooperation. The difficult but essential work of the states, the cities, the farms, and the many parties that share the rivers coming together to divide the shrinking supply fairly and to invest together in the resilience of the whole system. These are the options that remain, and none of them is easy, and none of them alone is sufficient. Together, however, they offer the Southwest a path through the crisis, a way to adapt to a future in which the rivers carry less and the reservoirs hold less than they once did. The region that built great cities in the desert and farmed land that nature never intended to be farmed did so through extraordinary ingenuity and determination, and that same ingenuity and determination will be needed now, not to conquer the water as the last century sought to do, but to live within its limits. The options that remain are harder than the ones already used, but they are real. And the future of the Southwest depends on the wisdom and the will with which the region embraces them. All right, I know this is the second time I am bringing this up. You can roll your eyes at me. But honestly, if you have made it this far into a video about the Southwest reservoirs, you clearly care about this, and a lot of you watching still have not subscribed. I am not going to make you feel bad about it, but that one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel fighting a low sub rate. It really is important to us. That is the last time I will ask. Promise. Let's finish. What the emptying reservoirs are telling us, having looked at what the reservoirs are, why they are emptying, and why the Southwest is running short of options. We can step back and consider what all of this is telling us. The first lesson is that the security the region felt for so long was, in part, borrowed from the past, drawn from reservoirs filled in wetter times, and from an assumption that the rivers would always carry the generous flows recorded when the water was first divided. As the drought and the warming have revealed, that assumption no longer holds, and the region must adjust to the reality of rivers that carry less and reservoirs that can no longer be counted upon to fill. The emptying reservoirs are, in this sense, a message from the present about the future, a warning that the old ways of using water cannot continue and that the region must change. The second lesson, however, is that the situation, serious as it is not hopeless. The Southwest has enormous resources, ingenuity, and experience, and it has already made great strides in using water more wisely than it once did. The options that remain are difficult, but they are real, and the region has the capacity to meet the challenge if it acts with foresight and cooperation rather than delay and division. What happens to the Southwest will depend on the choices its people and its leaders make in the years ahead, on whether they can bring demand into balance with supply, invest in new sources and deeper conservation, and share the shrinking water fairly. The reservoirs are emptying and the easy options are gone, but the story of the Southwest's water is not yet written, and the region that built so much through determination and ingenuity still holds the power to secure its future, if it chooses to use it. The emptying reservoirs are telling us that the time for comfortable delay has passed, and that the harder work of adapting to a drier future must now begin in earnest. The pale rings on the rock are not only a record of loss, but a challenge to everyone who depends on this water to act while real choices remain. That challenge is also an opportunity, a chance for the Southwest to prove that human ingenuity